when you go back a step, the government's been prepared to intervene to support Rex. I support that. They've been prepared to intervene. Rex is owned. I've met with their boss in Singapore, and the fact is the government intervened there. What we're talking about here is the Australian national interest. If 16,000 people directly lose their jobs, that is 16,000 people who are on the Centrelink queue, not contributing to the national economy as we emerge from this crisis. And the key to coming out of this crisis stronger is to make sure that the structures of our economy remain in place. That's what JobKeeper is about, keeping relations between an employer and their employees. And the fact is that this is about the interests of these workers, but also the national interests. The government says it provided $1 billion. Let's get rid of that myth. A complete nonsense. The money was around about $150 million backdated. The rest of that money was for charges and fees to be waived for things like air traffic control, Air Services Australia fees and charges. The planes aren't flying, therefore there's no fees to be waived. $400 million of that has been given to Air Services Australia, an entity of the government that has previously provided dividends to the government in order to help its revenue streams, and paid for, of course, by Virgin Australia, Qantas and the other airlines. So this is in Australia's national interest. This should be regarded as an investment that will produce a return in jobs, a return in future economic growth, because the consequences, particularly for our regions, if you take out Virgin Australia from regional flying, particularly in a place like Queensland, it will have a significant impact on employment growth in those regional cities.
How big a risk would it be?
One at a time.
How big a risk would it be, though, for taxpayers to plough money into aviation when we really don't know how that industry is going to look in the wake of COVID-19? We don't know, for instance, the travelling habits of the flying public.
What we know is that we got the structure right with the aviation white paper, with essentially 2 full-service airlines with budget airlines attached to them. And we know that we got that right during the period in which I was the aviation minister, because we know that it served the country well. And what we know is that if you have a single airline, we've seen it before. Go back and have a look at the prices which people were paying to fly from Sydney to Melbourne when you had an effective monopoly during that period. So we know it will have an economic impact. And we know also that regions have been better serviced than they have ever before because of the competitive nature of the airline system. And part of the other solution, you've got to look at the counterfactual. What is the alternative? The alternative is people losing their jobs. The alternative is a single Australian domestic airline with perhaps competition, as Scott Morrison has raised in the past, not just during this crisis, of removing the restrictions on foreign airlines flying domestic routes in Australia. That was a push when this government came to office. What that would do would ensure that foreign airlines, Singapore for example, might want to fly between Sydney and Melbourne. They would jump at that. But they certainly wouldn't be flying to Wagga, be flying to Coffs Harbour, be flying to Ballina. They wouldn't be doing that. They would be cherry picking. And what you'd then have as a response to that is that foreign-based entities like Jetstar Asia potentially coming into Australia to fly as well when you get rid of cabotage, an undermining of conditions, an undermining of the fact that Australians are proud of the safety record of our domestic aviation sector. It's the best in the world, bar none. And the idea that we would give that up. And also it will have an impact on our international sector as well. We fought very hard to get Virgin Australia access to the US system. What that's done what that's done is provide competition on that route. That's so important as well for Australians.
So can you step through what
One at a time. I'll come back. Yeah.
So two questions. What is the extent to which you think the government should take an equity position? 100%, 50%, just a bit? And the administrator this morning has said that he's already received expressions of interest from unnamed entities to recapitalise his airline. Why would you not let that process go through its course?
The concern that we have about letting the market rip on this is that people will be looking at coming in, looking at the profitable sections, the profitable routes potentially of an airline, say Sydney-Melbourne, Sydney-Brisbane, are consistently in the top 10 in the world. Sydney to Melbourne has indeed at various times been first, the most travelled on route in the world. They won't be interested in flying as I've flown on Virgin into your Gladstones or into Townsville or into Mackay. They'll be interested in cherry picking, people losing their jobs through a restructuring of the company, and our concern is that the Australian national interest needs to be served with two full-service airlines. And we know that the sort of build-up of the skills of the people behind us is the greatest asset of this airline.
So what is the equity that you recommend?
Well, the fact is you don't need, if you have government entity as a market signal, what that will do, you don't need a huge amount. In the past, there were discussions took place with over other airlines. At that time, indeed, with this government, so towards the end of 2013, there was examination and Treasury were providing advice to me prior to the election, and then after the election to Joe Hockey as the Treasurer, that looked at an equity injection into Qantas. That was considered at the time, was publicly debated at the time. At the time, the view of Treasury was that a small equity injection would send a market signal and would then be able to be downsold down the track once we get through this crisis. We have to bear in mind that this crisis isn't a result of market failure. It's a result of a government decision to shut the market. And that's why talk of market-based solutions at the moment is a triumph of ideology over common sense. That is what it is. Now, Scott Morrison has said that there isn't a blue team or a red team. Well, there's a red team behind me here. They're wearing the Virgin Australia uniforms proudly, contributing to our national economy. It's about time that Scott Morrison put aside the ideological blinkers and gave the support that is required.